For everybody that isn't Tristan or Suresh or myself, there is a Q&A. So we'll have that for people to be able to submit their questions and things like that. Tristan's gonna be able to take over the screen here in a second and present, and then we'll do the Q&A. People can vote up and down on the Q&A as well. And then, typically what we've seen with some of the data mesh stuff is the chat can be pretty fun. So if people want to get in the chat and both talk back and forth to get some interesting perspectives from each other, but also some, I don't know if I want to call it trash talking exactly, but there's usually some fun stuff going on in the chat. And then after the presentation is done, we'll have time for Q&A so that you can really get some great perspective from people who are doing this as to how they started and how the journey's going and all of that. So please be respectful that there are certain things that they might not be able to comment on, but outside of that, I think we're good. So I'll give the brief intro of just basically welcome everybody to our inaugural meetup. This is awesome. Huge amount of interest. And then where did I actually put your introductions? There it is. Okay. So who will be giving the presentation today is Tristan Baker, and he's been with Intuit for 15 years and spent the better part of that time in and around data. His current work involves leading the architecture for key platforms enabling machine learning, stream processing, analytics for the whole company, and he's one of the people really leading their data mesh initiative. And then Suresh will be joining in as well, and especially for the Q&A. Suresh Raman has been with Intuit for 5 years and in and around data and analytics for most of his career. He leads product management for the key platforms enabling machine learning, stream processing, and analytics for the whole company. So obviously we've got two people that are very in the know as to what's going on with their data mesh implementation. So with that, I'll let the two of you take it over. I think Tristan, you probably got some slides and stuff to go through, but I'll let the two of you kind of run with it from here. If you need me, I'm here. Otherwise, I'm on silent on mute.
Thanks, cool.
Thanks so much.
Right on. I'll share my screen. Hopefully this works. Everybody see it? You see it, Suresh? If you see it, I think we're probably good.
Yes.
Yep. All right. I'm gonna hit present.
Thumbs up.
And then we're still seeing things. Still good? Okay. So yeah, thanks, Scott, for that introduction. So yeah, Suresh and I are joining today I heard this is the inaugural meetup. So I'm happy to be presenting at the first one of these. And if I'm wrong about that, and it's the second or third, well, I'm happy to be presenting at the second or third one too. But Suresh and I, and Allison, who couldn't be here today, but she contributed quite a bit to the slides as well. You guys can find us on LinkedIn at any of these LinkedIn spots. We're happy to connect afterwards, connect during Q&A and connect afterwards as well. I've already connected with probably some of you over LinkedIn and had a few conversations with you guys. So we certainly appreciate the feedback and the opportunity to collaborate. You might imagine that we're kind of like, you guys are seeing a lot of in the kitchen sausage making. We're not super advanced at this. I think the state of the art of data mesh in general is still somewhere early on the Gartner hype curve. I'm not exactly sure where yet, but somewhere towards the beginning. So by that definition, I don't know how far anybody is truly along on this journey. And I don't think Intuit is any exception, but we're certainly in the thick of it. And I'm happy to share what we're doing, where we've come from, and what's next. And there's still quite a lot next that's coming up. So there might be a little bit of forward-looking stuff in here as well. But in any case, Suresh and I are partners on a lot of the work that Intuit does in this space. And so Suresh is going to join me for a couple of these slides. He's going to dive into the details of our product and the product strategy around this. And then he's going to help me with the Q&A as well. You ready to go? Here we go. So I'll start a little bit with arriving at a data mesh. And then I want to get into kind of our vision and 4-part strategy now with 25% more parts. So if you've read the blog, I'm pulling quite a bit of content from a Medium post that I put up maybe 2 or 3 months ago. But there's a couple of additions. And so there's a fourth part to our strategy that we've recently contemplated. And so I'll talk through that a little bit as well. This should probably take us 20, 30 minutes, and then that'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. So we'll get to the Q&A in a minute. So first, how did we get here? So a brief history of data infrastructure, late 20th century. I kind of have to trust that this was the case in the late 20th century. This might, I think it was in high school, maybe when this was happening, and a little bit oblivious to some of this, but you kind of had everybody in the same database, right? So your developers were reasonably happy, but your analysts borrowed time on the database, spent off hours so that they didn't stress the database. The analyst was sort of the timid tenant, and it was mostly probably financial monthly analysis. It was kind of like how analytics maybe happened many, many years ago. Then we sort of got to more analytics needed. It wasn't good enough to just have people work for a few hours at the end of the month in the evening. We wanted to do deeper product-based analysis. We got into the business of replication. So we'll periodically replicate the state of the database over to some other database, and the analysts get an opportunity to, or the analysts or anybody that needed data got an opportunity to spend their time, at least on a database and a system that was decoupled from the upstream system. But it still relied on ETLs, and maybe the data was highly periodic, maybe weekly or daily, et cetera. And it kind of creates this chasm, right? So it's the beginning of now, there being a separation of concerns, but not really any of the formal capabilities that you might need to ensure that these two groups of folks can continue to communicate clearly over data. Then you get into maybe the second decade of the 21st century, and you get the cloud being born, which allows you to separate data from compute. You can do a lot more. You can do bigger scale jobs, and you need probably to do hourly analytics. And now things are getting really complicated. So you bring in data engineering teams to help stabilize as much as they could the translation and movement of data between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. So you've got the product cloud, and maybe you have the analytical cloud on the other end. And the data engineers come in to fill the gap in the complexity of the systems that are required to keep this working, which kind of brings us to current state. So you've got a big data engineering team in the middle. You've got the data users on one half and the data creators on the other. You've created even more layers of indirection and complication that makes it hard for data scientists to interpret the data. It starts to introduce a lot of tribal knowledge into the equation. So your most successful analysts tend to be the ones, and scientists tend to be the ones that have been here the longest, because still there's no formality in the way that these systems are built and interoperating. And so what does this sound like today? Well, here's what we cannot scale sounds like from the users that Suresh and I spend time talking with. So discovering data. Where can I find data about a particular thing? Where can I find the data source from a particular product or service? These questions become harder to answer. Understanding data. Who can approve my access so that I can see samples of the data? What is the schema of the data? What is the business meaning and the context of the data? Is this data related to other concepts? Is it joinable to other data? Because now you've got data maybe coming from lots of different systems into one big pile. It might be conceptually related, but there's nobody there to tell you that you can join table A to table B and get something sensible back. Trusting data. Now there's a lot of systems in the mix and people in the mix involved in moving the data around. So how do you know that you can trust it to show up every day? What system produces it? What other systems use this data? What is the quality of the data? Is it clean? Which team supports this data if it breaks? Data understandability, again, kind of gets into the meaning. Who can approve? Oh, wait, should have read this before I got into it. This is just a copy paste error. Sorry, I'll have to riff on data understandability.
This is around the statistics and the profile of the data.
Thanks, Suresh. So understandability was intended to be, the semantics of it. Who's helping me understand what this data means? Who's profiling it? Can I get distributions that show me the likely values, the typical values? Can I figure out when a particular set of values is falling outside the typical range that might indicate that there's an anomaly, that kind of thing. Publishing data. So how do I describe, so this gets now from consumption side to the production side. Assuming you have producers that want to contribute to a data ecosystem where the data that they're creating is easily consumable by people that are in a position to want to consume it, are we giving people that want to do the right thing the tools and the guidance they need to do the right thing? So how do I describe my data so that others can understand what it means? Where do I host my data so that other systems can access it? Data systems are complicated. How can I build and operate my process on top of one? What are my operational responsibilities once my process data is in production? How do I meet my compliance requirements for processing, storing, publishing data? And I'll pause on this one a little bit because compliance, we think a lot about developer productivity and user productivity being a key driver of the way that we design our product and the way that we prioritize the things that we want to work on. But there's another stakeholder at the table here as well, which is sort of our compliance and security teams that would prefer that we all lived by the principle of least access privilege. So how do we balance the desire for ease of access with the desire for least access privilege? And then there's a whole world of compliance as well that is interested in auditability of permissions changes, auditability of systems changes. And Intuit is maybe in a unique position among other companies, which is Intuit is in the business of helping to improve customers' financial lives, both consumers that are filing taxes or managing their personal finances, as well as small business owners or business owners that are in the interest of growing their business and making smart financial decisions on behalf of their business. So Intuit is not, the federal government that's filing your taxes. We're not your employer. We're not a marketplace where you can sell your products if you're a small business owner. But these are the places where our consumer clients and our small business clients do business. So the information that we need in order to help these clients make the best decisions they can actually live in other companies' systems. So Intuit is strategically, it's strategically important for Intuit's business to be able to bring in data from your financial institution, from eBay, from Amazon, from Etsy, where you might be selling your products, so that we can kind of aggregate all that information, analyze it holistically, and help you make good decisions. But often when you go to these companies and want to share data with them, it comes with a lot of restriction. Like, yes, you can bring in financial data, but from your financial institution, but now there's a lot of compliance and governance requirements that come along with it. So if Intuit is going to be successful in helping our customers make smart financial decisions, we need to be really, really successful in the way that we manage consumer data. And that includes in our front-facing products, as well as our back-end analytics systems, where our more and more our analysts, our data scientists, our product engineers, and our product managers are using data to make decisions. So we need to be in the position to be able to guarantee as strongly as we possibly can that data is not going to be misused. The data will only be used in accordance with the way that clients are indicating that they consent to, as well as in the way that our third-party partners are indicating that they would prefer their data be used and not used. So being more rigorous about compliance and our governance and security responsibilities is extremely important. And even, I mean, there's really good business reasons why it's important for Intuit to be able to do this well. So I wanted to spend a few minutes kind of doubling down on that one. It does motivate a lot the way that we think about this problem. It's a data worker productivity problem, but it's also a business problem that if we solve it well, I think we'll position Intuit well to be very competitive in the business that it's in. So that's kind of what we cannot scale sounds like in the setup that we have today, and the one that we're actively looking to change. And so this motivates kind of our forward-looking ideas about what we think the future should look like, which I guess would be the third decade, the one that we're in now, of the 21st century. So we have data treated as code, data service as a facet of a product, data responsibility being decentralized, so that you don't have a single platform team as a choke point in the middle. Producers taking responsibility for data everywhere that it's being produced. Producers feeling like their downstream consumers have an equal seat at the table, and their needs need to be met and prioritized among the needs of all the clients that are being served by a particular product or service team. And the data platform really and the platform engineers become solely focused on providing an ecosystem that governs and manages the lifecycle of data and machine learning. And these are the principles upon which the data mesh is established. So hopefully this aligns with your understanding of it as well. But this is the way that we think about the problem. And from this, I'll move on to our vision and strategy in 4 parts. As you might imagine, selling the idea of a data mesh is more of a how, or at least around here, the word data mesh, we've decided to leave it as a how. What the business wants to understand is how is this going to solve any of the problems on the previous slide. So the strategy and the vision, we spent, Suresh and I spent a large part of our effort over the last probably 6 to 9 months, making sure that we had a clearly stated vision, a strategy that lined up to key business initiatives at the company. So the ability to solve particular financial problems for our customers, the ability to solve particular productivity problems for our data workers, and the ability to allow Intuit to comfortably and confidently move into the space of managing more and more of our customers' data. So those were the kinds of things that we wanted to make sure that we could ladder up to. And it's the way that we went from from vision to strategy that broke it down into hopefully 4 chunks that people could understand and see how it directly laddered up to some of the problem statements that we led with in the first section. So in 7 words, or however many words that is, 10-ish, our vision is to enable more Intuit teams to more easily use and create data. And there's a lot to unpack underneath use and create, but when we say use and create, we mean it with all the ilities that would normally come along with it. Securely, at a low cost, in a productive way, we want people to be able to use and create data. So the 4-part strategy, the first one is stewardship. Establishing at the company a culture of stewardship that ensures accountability for a set of defined responsibilities in building and managing their solutions, including adherence to a set of defined best practices to produce only high quality data. So this is kind of like a people process aspect of our strategy. We need to establish sort of expectations about what it means to be a steward and be responsible for building and managing a solution that produces and consumes data. We need to make sure that we have a mechanism and system in place that not only identifies stewards, but clearly identifies their responsibilities, measures those stewards or stewarding teams really against those responsibilities in a way that we can report on periodically and set goals for quarterly and yearly goals for kind of moving the needle on stewardship. The second part is organizing people, code, and data, which is a systematic approach basically for organizing the people, the code, and the data, which clearly identifies the owners of the business problem and its solution. We'll get into it in a minute, but this is certainly not the case in portions of our data environments today. There's lots of code and lots of data, but it's not clear always how to easily and quickly identify the owners of those things. It takes a lot of time to chase these people down, which means it's hard to hold them accountable for making improvements to this environment. Self-serve products is intended to be the mechanism by which we support the stewardship responsibilities we're going to lay on these people's shoulders. So it's one thing to say, hey, you're responsible for X, Y, and Z, and I'm not going to help you or provide any automation tooling that's going to make that easier for you to do. It's another thing to say, you're responsible for X, Y, and Z, and we've anticipated the way that you're going to work so well that X, Y, and Z come built into the products that we're going to build for you. So that means a rich suite of self-serve products that enable teams to more easily author, deploy, govern, and operate their own solutions, aided by automation and processes that support best practices and high quality as a precondition for deployment. And I want to double down on the as a precondition for deployment. It's not necessarily true today that we have a checklist and we sit there and go, yep, you're good, you can go to production. but that's going to be much more true in the future. One way to prevent the confusion and proliferation of bad data that we might have today is to have in place the checkpoints and the guardrails and the single path to deployment to production that we can measure whether or not the owners of a product, the owners of a service are meeting the standards that we're setting. And if they're not, we can fail a test, we can fail a deployment, we can push back or otherwise monitor and report on where we're doing well and where we're not. So that the accountability comes with the ability to measure and comes with the ability to, some might say enforce, others might say encourage the right kind of behavior. And then the bonus fourth part of the strategy that I'll be talking about today that we haven't really talked about much publicly, so this might be the first time that we're sort of saying it more loudly publicly, is getting to a place where we can rationalize data definitions. So in the first, self-serve products and organizing people, code, and data and stewardship, those are about sort of just tidying house, being good housekeepers and custodians of data. But this gets a little bit more into enforcing or encouraging appropriate data definitions and getting a little bit into the space of semantics, where we ask for, where we develop a process for rationalizing all critical data definitions at the company so that data concepts like customer, product, and entitlement are unique, reusable, and non-conflicting. Some of our original motivating problem statements and questions, some of them sounded a little bit like, how do I know what this data means? And how do I know that this data here about customers is the right customer table that I should be looking at and not one of these other 500 tables that are also called customer? How do I know that I can join this customer table with this product entitlements table and come up with products that customers are entitled to and be confident that this is a source of truth, or at least a definitive answer to that question? That's another kind of class of problem that our users struggle with. And so we're contemplating a process and tools and methods for making sure that these data definitions are rationalized, again, before things go to production. So we're going to go into each one of these in a little bit more detail. I'll start with stewardship. I think I'm going to hit them in order. So we'll start with stewardship, and then organizing and self-serve products, and then rationalizing data definitions. So this is just like a very high level example. In order to sort of convince the company, this is more around kind of changing the mindset at the company and convincing folks at the company that stewardship and accountability, and maybe changing who has traditionally been in charge of things to a different group of people, changing that to people who more deeply understand the business problem that a particular set of data or a solution is intended to solve. So one of these examples I'll walk through is the one that we've called it the One Intuit account management, which is a cross-ecosystem effort that attempts to make sure that our customer support agents have a very clear, correct, and accurate understanding of who it is that they're speaking with on the other side of the phone or the other side of the chat. So we have a lot of different places in our products where customers can update their profile information. And we tend to not have all those things rationalized on our back end by the time that we are supporting our agents with their view of the customer. So we have customers making 3 million, I guess, unnecessary calls, resulting in a high number of agent contacts on our backend systems. So central data engineering teams tried to put it all back together with little involvement from Intuit account services teams. We want to change that a little bit to, instead of having a bunch of poorly understood data in our analytics systems for analyzing our contact rates, for putting together profiles of information to serve our customers, to transforming that into data APIs that our customer teams develop, where we nicely organize the data into sensible domains around billing and monetization, and that the teams involved in this are the account team primarily, with a little bit of data engineering support. But the account team is the one that is intended to have most of the domain knowledge, all of the domain knowledge, and express that in a way that the data engineering team can partner with to put the pieces back together again. And the impact of approaching this problem in this slightly different way is that we are able to create a single ecosystem experience. We're able to increase developer productivity. We're able to accurately create customer records that we can use to serve our customer agents. And in FY21, we were able to significantly save from fewer customer support calls. So there's a couple of things to highlight here. One was the actual bottom line business impact, which is lower customer support calls. But the thing to highlight was like how we did this, and the how was making sure that the account team and the teams that most closely understand the data treat this problem as if it's a problem that their service is intended to solve. Just as much as the account team is intended to create services that help log our customers in and validate their identity and establish entitlement relationships between the customer's account and a product, we ask them to also own the problem of making sure they understand how their analytics is done on the back end and how the data sets that they produce and the data APIs that they could or should be creating can make for better customer support calls on our back end. So how do you scale this across an entire company? That was like one example of one team. What we need to do is kind of do this across the entire company. And this is a screen grab of a spreadsheet that we're going to be using. And I say going to be because this is kind of teeing up a lot of work we'll be doing over the next year. How to get more green than red is the goal of this spreadsheet. And what we're saying is, hey, identity domain, you own N number of services. Those services have CDC pipelines, they have domain event pipelines, and they have data entities. We need to make sure that your team is the one that is primarily responsible for building, for designing, building, governing, and operating that thing, and that you're not relying on a central data engineering team to do that work for you. The reds here are the names of currently central data engineering platform teams that handle these use cases among many other use cases across many different domains. And the goal in this spreadsheet anyway is to flip the the reds to the greens so that identity is the primary responsible party for designing in this example, pipeline ABC. They need to design, build, govern, and operate it, and have less and less reliance over time on a central data engineering team to do that for them. So this is kind of made up numbers, but the way that we're structuring how we measure this is accurate. And we would do this for not just the identity team or the teams in the identity domain, but we're, I think, to give you a sense of scale, maybe Intuit has 100 or 150 unique domains of capability and teams that operate in them. So we're going to do this for all 150 of those teams over, I'm guessing, a probably 2 or 3 year period to slowly move the needle from what I would assume today is maybe in aggregate across all these domains, 20%-ish to in aggregate across all these domains, 100%. We want these teams to own the life cycle of their pipelines and of their data, more so than we want them to rely on central engineering teams. The next thing then is organizing people, code, and data. This is, I'm going to kind of build up to the totality of information that we need to collect to say that we've accurately organized people, code, and data. So at the base layer of information we need is just sort of the raw information about physical systems that describe where data is stored and where code is executing. And this describes where data is physically located so that it can be accessed. So with just this information, you would know where, like, how to create a connection string to a database and start querying it. Given that you have the right permission and network access, you do need to know location information so you go physically connect to something. But if that's all you had, then you just have a bunch of green and blue code and data locations that are kind of swimming in space with very little understanding of what's in them, or at least very little automated or specific understanding of what's in these locations. So layered on top of that is the data product definition that I've written about, or that has been written about by a number of people in a number of different locations. So if you can capture basic dependency, ownership, and classification information, then you can begin to provide a ton of extra additional context that helps you understand how this can be better governed, secured, and operated by the owning teams. So the difference between this picture and that picture is not I mean, the content of the data systems themselves is no different. The code that's been written is no different, but now you have a ton of extra context that helps you understand who's responsible for it, what the operational dependencies are between these systems, the classification information, hopefully, of these systems in general, so that you can understand what compliance requirements they might have, et cetera. This is why, for example, organizing people, code, and data matters. In a recent exercise, we kind of went through our data lake environment and found that 50% approximately of the tables and data sets in our data lake environment are either temporary or sandbox or staging or test or backup tables, meaning that they play no formal role in our operational systems. You wouldn't expect to see any of the things that we found in this set of 50% actually show up if you were asking people to tell me, hey, which of these data sets is your system actually producing on a regular basis, and which other systems rely on it? These are likely orphaned, abandoned things that would have no operational impact if they didn't exist. But because they do exist, they pollute our search results. They confuse people because they're named very similar to the things that they were copied from. And it just makes for a generally harder to trust environment, as well as one that's harder to govern and harder to operate. Because even if these things are copies of tables, Intuit still has an obligation to make sure that we've have a good understanding of why it's there, and we keep it around no longer than it actually needs to be there. The last thing then also is ownership. So 50% of tables don't have clearly identified owners. That's not to say that we don't know who owns them, but it is to say that the ownership information is not written down in one place where it's easy for us to track down. There's a lot of tribal knowledge involved in tracing down the owners of, for instance, these temporary sandbox tables. We have to sit there and manually go through logs. We have to read wikis. We have to ask friends of friends who was the last person to know what the content of this table was. And we go through these exercises more frequently and painfully than I would like to admit. And I think we have an opportunity to do this much better if we got a systematic approach in place for organizing people, code, and data. So I was going to have Suresh here talk more about the self-serve product portion of our strategy. So why don't you take it from here, Suresh?
Thanks, Tristan. So if you go to the next slide, the goal with self-serve products is multifold. Number one, obviously, given how diverse the data ecosystem is and the number of technologies involved, we want fewer things to be learned for data workers and people who are creating data products. So goal number one is data worker productivity. But also, when we think about the data mesh, the exact previous slide that Tristan was on is, how do you establish ownership without actually having to go and collect this ever so often? How do you know what table is being produced by whom? For governance reasons, for compliance reasons, self-serve offers a way to capture this information, to capture lineage, and it allows us a way for creating this constantly organized and evolving ecosystem. So here are some of the capabilities we have when we think of the self-serve capabilities. One is on the data processing side and on the data serving side. And some of these names are internal code names for some of our products. So for example, Superglue is our Spark-based ETL service. MSAS is what we use for a lot of our Kubernetes kind of workloads. Ingestion for doing our CDC data capture and batch ingestion from external systems, as well as our first-party transactional sources. And down this list, where you have different personas in the data lifecycle who need to create data, publish data. So giving them these self-serve experiences so that they don't have to go and do this themselves, and in the process create something that does not have any owner or that cannot be ascribed to any relationship. And on the right-hand side, you have the different ways of consuming data. So, going from the rawest level of S3 buckets to a ML model that can be published as an API for real-time consumption. And then you have data mart tables and so on. And a lot of these are tied to specific technologies. And if you go to the next slide, for our next year, these are some of the goals we are thinking of for self-serve across our different products. And the way we think about it is in the area of infra provisioning, so that it's easy for anybody who needs to create data to provision infrastructure, to debug infrastructure, to monitor and things like that, and measure cost if cost is going up. The second is more in the space of creating data products where you're authoring data from a Kafka topic or from a S3 bucket. So being able to create these authoring workflows without having to, and doing this in a collaborative fashion as a team, so that somebody like Tristan and I can work together to create a stream processing application or something where we can author an event schema together. Again, over here, there is no single product or underlying technology. This will be a combination of things we build ourselves, things we source from vendors. So for example, leveraging SageMaker in some of these places. For observability, we are planning to use Monte Carlo, using a combination of open source Airflow as well as Argo that's in-house for the orchestration. So there is no one solution that fits all, but I think the power of having these self-serve interfaces, it abstracts away the need to learn these technologies, even if we change them under the hood. The last part is governance. So a key area for us is solving for access. If you remember the first slide Tristan talked about. So we want to solve for access management across the board, whether it is for topics, access to tables, access to S3 buckets, access to data in all its various forms, and which also leads into the compliance aspect of when people have access, how do we log this and then produce reports for auditability. And then privacy, along with GDPR and CCPA and all the future regulations, how do we make this a platformy component so that it happens on an ongoing basis? And if you need retention and archiving and anonymization, that can happen and that can be set up by the producers of the data. And I'll hand it back to Tristan.
Sure. So there's one more strategy to go, which is rationalizing data definitions. So this gets at the kind of information that we need to collect in order to make sure that we are adding to our environment unique, new, value-added data that is not inappropriately duplicating, or at least not duplicating in a way that you can't figure out, data concepts that have already been introduced. So we plan to do this through defining entities everywhere that we have a domain team producing information. We would ask them to describe logically the entity model of their system and map that entity model to the physical data locations that might exist under the covers. So logically, our OII, or one Intuit account domain, would have a logical definition of OII account, an org profile, and person profile, even though that data might be accessible in 3 physical locations, like a Kafka topic where you could see the changing state events that describe this changing state of the account, a REST API where you could go query for the current state of an OII account, as well as an analytical data table in our data lake, where you could look at the history of every account that's ever been created and its change over time. This process, or there's also a process that we would need to build around this to ensure that when a team proposes the introduction of a new entity, that it's namespaced according to where that entity definition lives and makes sense, and also related to other similar entities that might exist in the ecosystem. And the relationships here are the blue lines. Among other things, this would help you understand, hey, if I joined a topic over here to a table over there, what's the logical thing that I'm going to get back? Well, in this case, you might get back which Intuit products an OII account is entitled to. So when you bring it all together, you get more or less Intuit's version of a data mesh. So I'm going to do a really cool animation here. Oh, look at that. So in 3 dimensions, you can see the kind of the clean layer of metadata, the basic layer, what we're calling the basic layer of metadata, and the raw layer of metadata. When you've got all those things together, you don't need tribal knowledge anymore, because you're in a position to be able to answer a ton of really interesting questions up front without having to hunt down all your friends or the person who's been here the longest to help answer these questions for you. So in this example, again, I'm hammering on the OII account thing, so I'll keep up with that example. So from the top layer, you could tell that entities OII account and Intuit product exist, and that there's an entitled to relationship between them. That from the basic information that we would have related to that, we would know that these entities are being produced by an upstream service called the Identity Universal Service and the Entitlement Reference Service. And then the raw information that, again, is related to all of this would tell you that you could find these entities in a topic. We call it the event bus, but it's our name for our enterprise Kafka system. An event bus topic and a data lake table where you can find this information in. So with this, you would know automatically, I suppose, that I could join the events in this table, the events in this topic, which are describing OII accounts, with the records in this table, which are describing entitlements and products. And you would know that you would end up with something logically that is the customers that are, or the accounts that are entitled to a particular product. You didn't have to ask anybody. You didn't have to find your friends to tell you. We plan on and will be cataloging this in a way that allows it to be easily searchable and interrogatable while somebody is sitting there in their discovery and exploration phase of their project, so that they can find the data that is of the most interest to them, figure out all the places where it might exist, figure out what it logically means, figure out who owns it, figure out if it's showing up reliably, get in touch with the team if there's that produces it, if there's any further questions, and then be hopefully on their merry way, creating the next value-added service or making the next data-driven decision for Intuit. And that about wraps it up. That was the last slide I had, so I can flip into QA mode. Again, this is where you can find Tristan, or I'm Tristan. This is where you can find Suresh and I on LinkedIn, and Allison, who is our resident stewardship expert and program driver, is a wealth of knowledge about how we're changing or attempting to change the culture of accountability around data at Intuit. So you can ask any of the three of us any of those kinds of questions.
Yeah, and I threw those into the chat as well. So if anybody wants to just easily click over instead of having to search for anybody, they're already in the chat. So we've got one question that is in the chat and 5 that are in the Q&A, and then I've obviously got my annoying list as well. But I'll let the two of you kind of decide whether you want to jump chat Q&A first or how you'd like to flow with that.
It's up to you. I'll let you be the moderator. So I'll go with interesting first.
Oh, okay. Well, I would want to start with one that I've seen a lot of people asking about, which you kind of covered it a little bit there for a second, but sorry, that's my dog. Cross, she thought that was the signal for me saying goodbye to somebody. But doing cross domain harmonization of things like events and things like that, right? There's cross-domain harmonization of static results, but like, how are you doing, or how are you planning on doing, you know, if you're looking at some kind of marketing attribution, you're looking at clickstream analysis of that versus maybe, you know, monetization and like, you know, down the line as to churn analysis or something like that, of whatever that would be. How are you approaching that kind of problem?
Sure, I'll take a crack, and then Suresh, you can
add to it
as well. So yeah, we do need to monetization analysis. We have centralized some of the effort around. Let me back up a little bit. We are pushing for. We have a project called ECS, which is our clickstream project, which involves standardizing the key tracking variables and standardizing things like visitor IDs, standardizing when a visitor is granted a visitor ID, establishing when a common language by which we describe a page visit, a common language by which we identify a page ID, and standardizing common interactions, or standardizing the way that we describe common interactions when we are instrumenting our marketing pages or any of our product pages. So this effort actually preceded our effort to say, hey, you know what, maybe we should be standardizing definitions of data across the entire company, not just where users are interacting with our websites. So we've developed a standard as well as a group of people at Intuit from across the business that participate in the construction of that standard, and we call it our clickstream standard. Yeah, where we've attempted to try to solve some of these problems, because Team A would call a page click something and call a visitor by some ID, and Team B would do something completely different, and we'd lose the ability to understand when a user, the same physical human being, went from page A from team A to page B from team B, we'd have a very difficult time stitching all of that back together. But Suresh, maybe you can talk more about our clickstream standardization project.
I'll talk about that, and I think I'll tie it back to another question I'm seeing in chat, which is where I'm assuming some part of the question is lineage also. And so when we have event like standards for our clickstream and somebody decides to use it, and let's say join it with something else for, let's say, churn analysis or monetization analysis, for doing, let's say, funnel attribution on how much each user is worth in terms of, every time you click or convert, how much approximately you're losing or bringing in, you would be merging that with some other data sets. So we have event collection standards for clickstream, just like we talked about creating standards for specific domain events, so that there is a very clear and consistent way to analyze what are defined as standard events, and there's a way for teams to express custom events also, that's separate. And then at some point in time, the custom events graduated to standard events if there are enough of those same kind of custom events. So there is a graduation process. And once again, you can do this in a manual fashion for only so long. And we are dealing with now multiple Google Sheets, where people are creating tracking plans. So now you need to come up with a self-serve way of doing this so that there is a standard template that you can copy from and then create your custom versions of it. And then you can package that code and push it into whatever backend you need to push it into. And then that in turn is creating ownership and lineage as it gets used, assuming it gets used through all the different parts of the journey through the self-serve components we have.
Okay, that's. I mean, if you have anything that you can publish on that, I know there are a lot of people that are are like, just how are we even approaching this problem, and then the thing of kind of going forward as to how that goes.
We should contemplate Suresh publishing something on around our clickstream stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've been doing a lot of really good work over there, and I don't know that we talk about it that loudly, so we might do that.
So one question that kind of came from two different people would be the around the data catalog. Like, how are you doing that? What is your data catalog? Like, how are you doing that kind of push-pull model of, we've talked about this a little bit in the group of, there needs to be some kind of broadcast API that comes out when you have a new data product versus you need to just manually put it into a data catalog, or, there isn't really tooling that's really built for data mesh data products that well to date. So like, how are you building your own, or how are you going along that journey?
Yeah, so we're using Atlas, which I'm sure people are familiar with. It's an Apache project. There's something called Apache Atlas. And we gravitated to it because it had a really flexible data model that allowed us to define the kinds of things that we wanted to track. So that was one thing that we gravitated to it for. The other is it does have that the option to do doing both the push and the pull model. So there's a lot of plug-inable crawling capability that does allow you to go out and discover what I was referring in here to the raw data. So without anybody telling you anything, I can go kind of like sniff the network or go crawl our data lake locations and other accounts, AWS accounts. And we can discover how many Hive tables we have, what they're called, what the schemas are, what their columns are, how many partitions they have, all those kinds of things. So that's what the pull model gets you. But the push model is one that we would like to lean on more heavily in the future. In fact, if I had to guess, I would guess we'd lean less on pull and more on push as we got better and better at this. And that comes back to some of the earlier statements I was saying around, as a precondition for deployment, we're going to make sure that we have the kind of information we need around what is your data product definition, what's the team that owns this, where's your documentation, where's your SLA promises, where's your reporting that shows whether or not you're meeting your SLAs or not. These are the kinds of things that we would love to decorate around a data product. And some of those, at least some of that information, where I think we need to require our users describe. The other things we can measure, like we can measure you against an SLA once you tell us what your SLA expectations are. And we might be able to scrape and pull that kind of information in. But where We do have a reasonably strong central platform team at Intuit, more so now than maybe even 5 or 10 years ago. So we have the investment and the energy to be able to develop what we call our kind of paved road solutions, which means like we have hopefully the system that anticipates the kind of thing that you want to create, and we can manage you cradle to grave, right? From the minute that you conceive of an idea to the minute you've got it into production, and then eventually you retire the idea, we have an answer for how to manage that complete life cycle. And if we do have an answer for that, then as a side effect of you going through the tools that we're offering, we can get a lot of the information we need into our catalog for capturing what your data product is.
Yep. I just wanted to add, like, catalog will power a whole bunch of experiences on top of it, the whole data discovery and exploration part, but then also access. A key part of what we want to do with access is getting ownership, so that, you know, when you request access, there's somebody on the other side to actually approve that access. And then along those lines, compliance and governance use cases, so that when you need to do retention and things like that. And the last part is observability, data quality indicators, showing all of that. All of that comes back to pushing this back to the catalog. And then all these authoring products that we talked about earlier is where all this metadata gets pushed back to the catalog. There are some areas where we would crawl and pull this information also.
Awesome. And there's a question in the chat, and I think one in the Q&A, and I had one that's kind of all around that, a little bit of governance. It sounded like you were saying that when somebody makes that request, that then there's a governance team that does. How much are you asking your data product owners to bring their governance decisions to their initial data product deployment versus, you know, that push-pull again of you know, if you make them adhere to 700 things that they have to hit on a checklist, then you're never going to get any of these things out. But like, is that in the cards, or is that something that you're trying to figure out, or how are you doing that governance? And, you know, Mauricio said, you know, what's your advice to kind of change that mindset towards a more distributed, federated governance model? You know, maybe a centralized governance team, but that governance isn't only on that governance team. Yeah.
I'll take a shot at it. I'll be honest. I mean, I don't know if we necessarily cracked it. Documenting governance, metadata, PII metadata on an ongoing basis is hard. So I think there are a couple of ways. So if you, the stewardship model that Tristan talked about, kind of enforces that every team that owns data or is creating data for a particular business domain or a business entity has 1 or 2 stewards that are actually thinking about the quality of the data as well as the governance aspects of this. And the second part, so that, like, as you distribute that ownership, you are distributing a part of the responsibility and the accountability for the governance. The second is the kind of things we can automate, whether it is for detecting PII information, detecting those kind of things, but also doing the ongoing audits of data in terms of who has access to what, how often have they access to it, when was the last time. So I think we want to get to the term, I think that Tristan mentioned, was least privileged access also, so that as people are getting access to something that may be only required for a certain business purpose, you don't give them forever access. You renew that access on an ongoing basis.
Okay, that's great. So Martin had asked about specifically slide 9. I don't know exactly what's on slide 9.
I can find out.
The provocation slide.
Let's find out. Slide 9. Yeah.
So, and sorry, I've got everything in the way. So, so, you know, specifically was asking, you know, who created this provocation? Like, you know, is exec buy into the provocation? Like, what was, I guess maybe even just if you've got a little bit around where did you realize that you had a real problem?
Yeah.
You know, of what was that, and how did you also kind of drive that buy-in internally? And was it top down, or was it bottom up, or was it kind of middle out? Or
yeah, middle out.
Yeah.
I like that. That's a good one. So we have a services. We have a reasonably strong platform team. There's a services organization that a few years ago went down the path of service mesh. And we're doing a few things, I think. One is I heavily rely on that analogy and the successes that are measurable and that we see when we're talking about our PD teams building services and being more productive service engineers and more easily integrate with other services and manage their services. There's a lot of analogy between the effort and the investment that we made for our service teams to be more productive. That could, I like to think, is an easy analog for some of the value that we see here as well. The other thing is that, both empirically and anecdotally, we hear all the time in our surveys of our data workers, things like, I spend too much time wrangling data. We can quantify that more or less. In the 60 to 70% of my time is spent at the initial phases of a project. 60% to 70% of my time is spent just trying to figure out where the data is, who owns it, what it means, how I can get access to it. So we have those numbers that indicate what those measures are. The other thing that's been declared, you can go look up Intuit's corporate strategy and mission, is an AI-driven expert platform. So that emphasis on AI has caused us to invest in an increase investment in things like data and AI, I suppose, and all the things related to it. And a very close cousin of AI is data. So I think that's kind of the tops down realization that you can't get to better AI without getting to better data. So we've made, I think, that connection in people's minds as well. But make no mistake about it, it does come with a significant amount of tops down effort, because at the end of the day, we do need a pretty significant level of investment. I mean, Suresh and I work in a data team of, how big is the Shoke Sword? 300-400 people, something like that. So we have a 300 or 400 person data organization. They're not all these platform engineers. Some of them are analysts and data scientists, but a significant portion of them are data engineers. And we're trying to help the business understand that actually the right maybe answer to getting to better data is over time to make the central data engineering team smaller and more narrowly focused on this last bullet point here. And then at some point you start to disperse the central analysts and AI experts into the domains that they are actually working on behalf of. And that's probably the future model for the company. So it's tops down, there's bottom up, there's probably a little bit of both and all of
I think what also helped was when you survey people who interact with data and you ask them how often they spend time doing data infra, data cleaning, as opposed to actual analysis, as opposed to actual data science. Those are just indicators that help build the case.
Okay, and I just dropped the link into the chat, which a lot of those questions that you specifically ask are in Tristan's original blog post on what Intuit's doing with data mesh. So I do recommend anybody to read through those at some point when I stop being lazy about it. I'm going to write a blog post called The Intuit Way about how you actually interview these people, right? Okay. How you interview your internal people to really understand what the problem set is, because I think it's a really, really good perspective that I think you've provided for people. I think it's a great tool.
Yeah. So, we do have a really strong product team that's looking at this problem with us. So we're not just a bunch of engineers, right? There's a significant amount of product research that goes into this approach as well.
Yeah, so we've got a question about, curious about your DevSecOps and your CI/CD strategies. Mm-hmm. It's in the chat.
Yeah, so CI/CD, DevSecOps. We do have our pipeline is where our continuous deployment pipelines is where we are more and more pushing a lot of these checks for a lot of sort of non-functional requirements associated with any system that we're attempting to push into production. So we have you'll have to remind me, Suresh, is it threat metrics and Qualys and a bunch of other things that
we have these scanning.
Yeah, we do a bunch of scanning of everything that goes to production. So we do have a security team that is focused on turning a lot of our security opinions about things into automation that we can enforce both during build and deployment time, as well as continuous observation of our deployed systems. So these, we deploy things kind of at all portions of the pipeline. During build time, we can scan the code and the other systems that are building your systems to push them out into production. And then once they're out in the production, we're constantly scanning things as well. So we've centralized a lot of the engineering or a lot of our security capability and turned those into engineering teams that are focused on automating a lot of what we need in order for Intuit to build secure environments. And that team then delivers those as services and capabilities that are integrated into the build and coding pipelines and best practices that we expect our teams to use, and that we arm them with, day one when they show up, I want to create a project. Great. We spit out the project template for you that has all these things already integrated in it. So it's hard for you to do it wrong at that point. You're pretty much shaking hands with the DevSecOps team the second that you start writing code. So I think that was your question, right? So the CI/CD process in general is going to be the pinch point that we have from a data mesh perspective to go in and say, okay, you've got quality testing happening here. You've got performance testing happening here. You've got security scanning and vulnerability scanning happening here. We're also going to put data mesh quality and data quality kinds of checks in your build and deployment pipeline as well, so that we can deliver data capability to teams without them having to be like PhD level data quality experts, right? It's about automating as much as we can, which does require that our users are adhering to the standards that we are publishing and advocating for on behalf of the business. Because if everybody kind of does everything in their own way, then it becomes difficult for us to really scale some of these approaches.
So we got one in the Q&A specifically that's got an upvote. So we'll go with that one as the next one.
Sure.
Do you think it's advisable to start adopting a data mesh approach if our data governance policies are still weak?
I think
yes.
Yeah. I mean, like, I would hope that a reason to use the data mesh is to bring your data governance policies to a better place.
Yeah.
Right. I was saying in the beginning that as much as we have motivation for worker productivity and building smarter systems as a reason to pursue data mesh, the other reason that we're pursuing it is because we think we can get a much better handle on the governance and compliance requirements that we're subject to. I mean, just having the owner's name written next to every data set that exists in your company in a reliable location is, I would have loved to have had something like that 2 years ago when we were pursuing our CCPA and GDPR compliance requirements on behalf of our company. I mean, we spent 3 months at the beginning of that project just trying to create a spreadsheet of who owns this table. If that were part of what it took to go to production was you had to write your name here, then we would have saved 3 months off the length of that project.
I know that feel. I was at a company that had never done any scheduled downtime. And so trying to put together just a list of the customer contacts was insane. So,
yeah.
So from the chat, you talked a little bit about the metadata and the data catalog and stuff, but where are you managing that metadata? Is it that there's a one-time metadata push into the catalog and it's always managed up there, or is it managed at the data product level and then that data catalog communicates with it, or how are you starting that and how do you kind of envision it as well?
Yeah, so envision is probably the better word here, because like I said, we are at the beginning of our journey. Like we haven't totally formalized the data product that I want to. I should be careful about how I use the tenses, I guess, in the way I answer the questions and I put this deck together. But whatever the future tense is what I should have been using, which is we intend to establish the definition of a data product, much like I had on, sorry, let me scan for it a little bit. This is that. That is more or less the metadata model that I'm actively developing and working with our teams, and in fact, working with our Atlas catalog team to make sure that this model is representable inside of Atlas, so that I can call an Atlas API with something that looks like, go register the metadata for this data product XYZ for me. So this is more or less the metadata model that we are establishing. But I will say, we will establish it, not have established it. It's not in use globally, broadly, everywhere. If you were to ask me that same question by the end of 2022, I would expect to have a past tense answer for you, which is yes. For a number of use cases, maybe not even all of them, this is exactly what we would expect to collect and catalog in our Atlas system. At the moment, that's kind of what Atlas looks like. We kind of want to get it to there, or at least we're somewhere between these two. If we go to Atlas today, I could have come armed with a screenshot, and at 1,000 feet, you would see like 3/4 of the Atlas map kind of looks like this, and the other quarter of it might look like this, but maybe not every line is 100% accurate, and some of these arrows are missing. So it's kind of slowly coming into sharper relief in reality, but it's not really going to be useful until it gets less sparse. And so we're working on making it less sparse.
Yeah. So another question from the Q&A is like, you talked a little bit about the data quality at the start and that your platform isn't fully there. You've got a good platform team to build it, but not necessarily that it's there. Like, how has that hindered your data? People kind of talk about, where do I start? Zhamak has said, go for creating a data product, but like, where are the blockers, and where do you think are the blocking and tackling to go? This is a long journey, right? You talked about it being a 4 or 5 year journey, but like, where do you think those first, like maybe 3 building blocks that you've got to go through start?
Yeah. What do you think, Suresh?
I'll think about this. I don't necessarily know if there is 1 or 2 specific ones. I would say getting the catalog story is probably important, because that's probably the one thing that's going to be touching every part of your data mesh journey, whether it's your authoring products or your consumer experience, like the consumption experiences, the discovery experiences, as well as the governance use cases. So I think it's really important to think about what your catalog backend will be, whether it's Atlas or something else, and the kind of data products you want to create, whether it's an ML model or a Kafka topic, or how you think about your data products. I think the second part also is, and I don't know if this is the spirit of the question that was being asked, and the second part of this is also, how do you establish some early successes? So how do you figure out what would life look like with a data mesh? So if there are 2 or 3 use cases you can go with an established success, let's say deduping data from your identity table, that in turn reduces the number of times people have to call customer care, or other ways of establishing benefits of doing this. I think those are some of the 2 or 3 key areas I can think of that you'd invest in.
One of the ways that we're tackling it is we're kind of lucky that one of the most important data sets to get right also has a team that thinks a lot about this problem in the same way I do. So I've got a colleague on our identity team that is just as happy about the notion and excited about the notion of data mesh as we are. And so he's actually very active and interested in the way that we're thinking about this problem and breaking it down. And also, identity is our most commonly referenced data set, as you might imagine, in our entire company, because everything hangs off of what's the ID of the customer in our identity system, because that's how you can link customers that have been in this part of the product with another customer that's been on the other part of the product. If they have the same account and they've logged in with the same username and password, then we'll get those account IDs to match across these different systems. So one way to think about tackling it is your identity system is the most commonly referenced, I would imagine, system and data set that you might have in your environment. So if you're looking at providing immediate benefit and value, the immediate benefit and value that we saw was standardizing the way people identify and name the references to the customers that they have in their data set. At the moment, if you were to go count the number of, if you look at 2 tables today, it's usually a reasonably good guess that something like this table over here has a column called cust ID, and this one over here has a column called CID. probably you can join those, but like nobody can tell you that for sure. So kind of standardizing the naming conventions is something that we're going to do around identity first, and making sure that our most commonly reused data set is the one that is the best behaved, is something that I think we're prioritizing at the very beginning of FY22 or of 2022.
And we're coming up on time, so I want to be cognizant of your time. I mean, I could literally ask you questions for
Let's do one more.
Sorry, what'd you say?
I said let's do one more. We got time for one more.
Well, then I won't take it myself. But hold on, somebody just asked one as well, so I'm just going to look at those. I guess there was one that was earlier asked in the chat as well about aligning incentives and things like that. How have you seen that around aligning incentives for people to become those data owners, but also data consumers, right? Because if you're trying to charge anybody for consuming any data, then that can make them hesitant to consume any data. Like, how have you started to approach that problem? If you've got a great framework for it, amazing. If you're just starting to try and figure it out, like what are the questions you're asking?
Yeah. I can take a shot at it. I think self-serve is a great lever for developer productivity. So that definitely, I think, sells itself without even thinking about the data mesh and things like that. Just selling folks on developer productivity, I think, is a very powerful incentive. The second aspect also along those lines, if you go back to, if you remember the slide Tristan presented on what cannot scale looks like, data discovery and data trust is another big area. So I think selling stakeholders and execs on the benefits of data worker productivity without actually mandating ownership is, I think, the first step. And then once you get there, I think then you start having the conversation of, how do you actually scale this out? And I think distributed ownership is the way to scale this out.
Yeah. And then the other, I think, thing that I've thought about, so I don't know, I don't have a great answer for this in terms of, there's kind of a tops down approach, and just make sure that, product teams recognize the value that the company gets when everybody is behaving and participating properly in kind of a data ecosystem like the data mesh is. That's certainly one thing that is necessary. But, I've contemplated like, hey, could we build like a little economy around data producers produce data, and if somebody consumes it, then there's some kind of compensation that's going back towards the producer, or cost sharing agreement between producer and consumer or something, so that you have like an economy where you're aligning incentives around well-behaved production and consumption. Maybe, that would be pretty complicated to build something like that, but I've thought about it. I don't know if I have a great answer. There's also the stick approach, which is like, if you don't do it, we'll turn your whatever yet red, and we'll yell at you in front of somebody important. That's also that's also a way to do it.
I think ThoughtWorks said that and a couple other customers, they're working on that same thing, but it is difficult because you want to encourage consumption, right? When it makes sense. And so you don't want to necessarily hit somebody with a stick because they're being curious.
Yeah,
you do want to make sure that you're measuring, are these things useful or that. So
well, the tricky part is like, the very first, some of these ideas are born out of serendipity, right? Like I just happened to find this data set and this one over here, and I just found this magical correlation between these two things. It wasn't a product request that I had to say, hey, you guys over there, make sure you're producing and you're producing, because I might in the future find a correlation that would be interesting. So getting the very, very early stages, how do you get somebody who's not producing anything to produce something? It's hard to say for sure, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, as we said, we want to be very cognizant of your time and everything, but thank you so much for taking the time here. Attendees, everybody, thank you for your great participation, and
thanks everyone for the questions. It was those are great questions. Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll work on getting the recording and getting that up to YouTube as well, and we'll work on getting the, if you're all right with it, getting the slides once we fix that one little thing, the copy paste there from whatever, and then we'll take care of that and get that out for everybody.
Yep. Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody. Thank you, Scott, for hosting this, putting it together.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.